all are like the remnant of Israel. As I sometimes do when we're ultra light like this, I know, I don't know if you all heard it, Dave is in under the weather this morning. I know Don and Kitty, he had said that they had some traveling and stuff to do in December. I don't know if today is one of those days or not, but we are extra few this morning. So as I sometimes do, I'll kind of throw it out there. Anything on anyone's mind that y'all want to discuss? And if not, we can get back into our book. But have any burning questions? Any thoughts on anything we've talked about here recently? Because I know I've thrown out some heavy hitting things, especially on these ideas of things like righteousness and whatnot that can confuse people very easily. So, any thoughts? I would, the only way to affect that forgiveness is the blood of Christ. Like I said, when he has the notion that their sins were temporarily washed away by the blood of bulls and goats, I don't think that's correct. I think it's more, and again, feel free to disagree. He's more of a scholar than I'll ever be, but I think he misses the mark on that one just a bit. Just like I said when he that passage from Romans, he took the what I would say is more the mainstream denominational view that because and he doesn't say all this, but it's kind of loaded in there. When Abraham acts in faith toward God, it has to be counted as righteousness because it's not actual righteousness. Now, again, he doesn't say that. He just says Abraham's righteousness was counted as such by God. The Calvinist kind of take on that, which most denominations adhere to, is because Abraham is depraved. He inherits Adam's sin, and thus he cannot do anything righteous. God has to look on his faithfulness and say, you know what? I'll count it that way, even though you can't actually do it. And again, that's kind of what he says. And I'm like, no, that's I think totally misses the point. And having that idea leads you to make some other bad conclusions. For example, what he says about bulls and goats. But anyway, any other? Yes. So I don't think so. Yes, it's forgiveness, but the only way that it actually happens is Calvary. I think that's the main point of Hebrews, right? Jesus is the answer for all of humanity, for us, but also for Abraham and David and everyone else. Like I said umpteen times, in Romans 3, Paul makes it abundantly clear that when he's talking about righteousness, he's talking about the righteousness of God, which is sending his son as a sacrifice. He says it explicitly. So then just a few sentences later, when he says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness, he's not talking about Abraham's righteousness, which is how most people, evidently including brothers, takes it. He's saying it was counted for God's righteousness, which is Jesus, right? Abraham was faithful to God, and God counted that for what you read in Hebrews, that the blood of Christ cleanses not only those of us who are Christians living under the new covenant, but those who lived under the first covenant also. His point being, again, you think about the overall context of the whole epistle, you're not saved because you're one of Abraham's seed. All right? That's his whole point, right? Being a descendant of Abraham is not what makes you one of God's people. It's faithfulness to God and being redeemed by the blood of his Son that makes you one of God's people. That's his whole point. In fact, he goes on to talk about Isaac and the seed and the promise and all these things. Any other thoughts on it? Like I said, it's a radically, if you get in a conversation about this with 9 out of 10 religious people that you know, they will not agree with that at all. But to me, it's kind of like, when you read Acts 2, what must I do to be saved? Repent and be baptized, every one of you. Like, oh, so you need to be baptized. And someone's like, no. And you're like, what? It says so right here, It's so simple. To me, this business of righteousness and justification is just as straightforward, but most people don't see it that way. Anybody else? True. The problem is that obedience to the gospel is the argument, right? But yeah, I agree. It would be nice if just take it at face value and be honest about what it plainly says. But anyhow, any other thoughts, complaints, questions before we continue on? So we got into this new chapter last week, talking about redemption. We talked about Colossians, and he talked about some of the problems going on in Colossians, all of which kind of folds up into what's known as the Colossian heresy. So does anyone have any idea about some of the basic thoughts of Gnosticism? So I talked about that. So last week, he mentions it here on page 82, 6 different things that Paul calls out in Colossians, and most, if not all of them, kind of revolve around Gnostic thought. What's kind of the basic idea of Gnosticism? The New Testament, so I guess the Old, so Maccabees, Judith, what are some of the others? Sirach, yeah, that one in particular. That comes later on. So the Old Testament Apocrypha is in the Catholic. If anyone's ever seen a Catholic Bible, it has more books in it than the one we use does. The Ethiopian Bible has Gnostic texts in it. So the Old Testament Apocrypha isn't included, I think, largely because of chronology, because the canon had already been considered closed. And I will say this about the Old Testament Apocrypha, though. It is, Maccabees in particular, 1st and 2nd Maccabees is a super useful text because it's kind of a historical account of what happens in the Intertestament period, especially with Antiochus IV. So it isn't considered canonical or inspired, at least by Protestants. Again, Catholics do, but they are useful to read nonetheless. There's New Testament extra-biblical books also, some of which are Gnostic. There's a Gospel of Judas, which is a Gnostic text. There's a Gospel of Peter. Off the top of my head, I can't recall if the Gospel of Peter is Gnostic or not. Judas is. There's a Gospel of Thomas. There are multiple infancy narratives. There are other sources about Christ's birth in early days that are different than the ones we have. And of course, going back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, there were debates. Which of these are legitimate and which are not. And it's rather clear in a lot of the New Testament books, especially Colossians and 1 John, that are arguing against Gnosticism, which was very much present during the New Testament time. So Paul's big contention everywhere he goes, in every epistle he writes, is this Jew versus Gentile. What does it take to be a Christian? There's also, however, at the same time, Gnosticism is a major influence in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. So, in fact, the word itself, gnosis, means knowledge. Gnosis with a G, knowledge. And one of the things about it is the Gnostics believe that you have to have a secret, special knowledge in order to truly be a Christian. So when Gnostics, look at Scripture, they look at it in a totally different way. To them, you have all these things that are kind of encoded, and it's almost like a secret society, right? And I'm trying to think of something like the Freemasons or the Illuminati, the Bilderbergers, right? It's kind of like if you want to be in the club, then you have to be initiated in, and you have to be told these special secrets. I don't know if anyone's ever heard a lot about Scientology, but like as you get into this cult, the further you go up, the way that you progress into higher levels is you get told these secrets. It's like, okay, you're a real member now, and we're going to tell you this that all the other people don't know. Correct. That's kind of Gnostic thinking about Christianity. It's like, well, on the surface, you have these basic teachings, be kind to your neighbor and don't steal and all these things. But if you want to truly be in the club, as it were, a real Christian, the way to get there is by this secret knowledge that gets passed along. But one of the main things that they adhere to, and you kind of hinted at it a moment ago, is God is pure spirit. Man is pure flesh. Flesh and spirit don't go together. They are it's like oil and water. They're incompatible. So for God to deal with man, you have to have multiple emanations. So you get like this chain of beings. And each one, as it kind of comes down the chain, is less and less spirit and more flesh. Until ultimately you get to Jesus, who is like the final emanation of God. But you've got this whole chain of other beings in between them. And Jesus, even though he doesn't appear to be fully flesh, he isn't. He's a step removed from flesh. So in books like 1 John, John is very adamant that Jesus came in the flesh. And if you don't believe that he came in the flesh, you're apostate, right? This is anti-Gnosticism, because Gnostics don't believe that. See, he's not pure flesh, he's a step removed. And then you have all these other emanations going up to God. So John argues against it. Paul, in Colossians, argues against it. And in one of the Gospels, Luke, if I'm not mistaken, makes a special point. When Jesus comes, when he's resurrected and he comes back and talks to the apostles, he eats the fish. They touch his hand. It's like he's physical. He's actually there. He's in the flesh. So when he mentions all these things here about the Colossian heresy, again, most scholars think that it's some form of Gnosticism. And just like other beliefs, there are varieties of Gnostic thinking. That's the main ideas. Right. Yeah, the Nicolaitans and others. It's a widespread problem at that time, especially later on. Paul talks about it on I would agree with him. Colossians being the main place you find it. But yeah, it's a big problem at the time. And like I said, there are multiple other texts that are not Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Thomas. There's a Revelation of John, right? There are numerous other texts that were rejected because they were Gnostic in their thinking. But anyway, Colossians deals largely with this, and he's going to use it as an example as we go through and talk about redemption. Interestingly, so if I were to say just redemption, like if someone came to you and say, hey, there's going to be a class, whether it's a ladies' class or whatever, and say the topic is going to be redemption, what would you say is kind of the go-to place? It's like I mentioned last week in the sermon, there are certain texts, thankfulness, Psalm 100, Love, 1 Corinthians 13. Joy, Philippians 4. They just immediately come to mind. Redemption. What is the classic? If someone came up to me and said, hey, in 5 minutes you have to talk about redemption, I'd be like, okay, because I know straight where to go. And he alludes to it here. He doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but he does mention it. What's kind of the go-to place for the idea of redemption? Any thoughts? I can think of two off the top of my head, but one in particular that always comes. You can bank on it. Kind of like if you say, talk about patience, Job. Ruth. Ruth is the go-to. Why? Why would you say Ruth is kind of the, if someone says redemption, it's one of the top things that fires off? Because she literally gets redeemed, right? It's like, you can't pick a better illustration of the concept because it literally happens to her, right? She and her mother-in-law, they're poverty-stricken. They're down and out in the ancient world where if you don't have a man of the house providing, you're destitute, right? They have to glean. They have to go behind the people working in the fields and pick up the scraps. They're in a bad way. But there's this concept in the Levitical law called a kinsman redeemer. What is a kinsman redeemer and what can they do? What do they have the legal right and ability to do? They can pay, basically they can take on the financial burden of this female relative who has no one else to provide for her and take her on essentially as a wife and say, well, I'm going to be the one to care for you. In the story of Ruth, she comes to realize that Boaz, the man who owns the fields where they're gleaning, is a potential kinsman redeemer for her because there's a family relationship. And her mother-in-law points this out, teaches her how to go about, approaching him about this. But then there's a snare. What was it? Does anyone recall? Someone else has the legal right before him, but they don't do it. Why? It's too expensive, right? He's like, this is going to cost me too much. I can't afford this. And then Boaz, of course, as we all know, steps in and does it. But the idea of redemption, I think we talked about it just a little beginning of the chapter, is you're buying something back. You're paying a price to get it back. In the case of a kinsman redeemer, it's a family member who is destitute and has no one to provide for them. You're going to take on the financial burden. You're essentially going to pay something to bring them back, and be the one to care for them. We talked a little bit, if I recall, about coupons, right? The manufacturer pays the store the price to get back what they lost in offering the discount. So Ruth is one. The other one that tends to come to mind, maybe secondarily, is Hosea, right? You recall Hosea, at God's command, took a wife named Gomer, who was a prostitute, and she did what you would expect a prostitute to do, and he ends up divorcing her. And then later on, she finds herself on the auction block waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. And God tells Hosea to do what? Redeem her. Buy her back. And he tells him that all of this that's happened, marrying her in the first place, having to feel the pain as she cheats on him, and buying her back, all of this is an illustration of his dealings with Israel. Right? It's like, you, my people, have been unfaithful to me, but I'm going to pay a price to buy you back, right? Redemption. Okay. Page 82, bottom of the page, redemption's true meaning. Because the important element of this review is that the heresy was focused on Jesus Christ, the Colossian heresy. In addressing this problem, Paul gives us insight into what our Savior has done for us. He says, my guess is that most of us don't like the feeling of being trapped. A Japanese warplane dropped a 1,760-pound bomb, which stretched us forward of a turret gun member to on the starboard side of the USS Arizona, December 11th, 1941. The ensuing explosion tore the front part of the ship apart, centered to the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Sadly, 1,177 crewmen died with her. Many of them were trapped inside the ship as it rapidly descended. The thought of their final moments puts a lump in my throat and a heaviness in my heart. It's also the case at Pearl Harbor that some of those ships were bombed. They were sitting in harbor, fully fueled, and that fuel, as it spilled out into the water, caught fire. and you had men who found themselves trapped literally in a burning sea around them. I can't imagine, but trapped, no way out. Similarly, we are all trapped in sin. Paul tells us all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. We are slaves to sin, trapped by Satan, separated from the God we love, Isaiah 59:1-2. As sinners, we live having no hope and without God in the world, Ephesians 2:12. I've said before that part of the challenge with, I think as Christians, we understand the danger involved with sin and the ultimate price that has to be paid for it. The difficulty in convincing people of that is they can't see you don't see the danger, right? If you're trapped in a burning house, it's right there in front of you. You understand that you're trapped and you need a way out, right? It's immediate, you're in danger, and you understand. You try to convince the world, yes, sin is a problem, yes, it's a mortal danger to your soul, and you need to escape this before it becomes too late. They look around them and they see nothing, right? It's like, what do you mean you're in danger? I'm perfectly fine. Everything's going great with my life. There's no danger. So I would agree with him that you think about being trapped in sin is just as deadly as these other examples he gives, but people certainly don't perceive it. Countless firemen and policemen flooded into the World Trade Center as others tried desperately to get out. In trying to save the lives of others, 343 police and fire personnel died. Through these deaths, we get a glimpse of what our Savior did to free us. Just as many people sacrificed themselves to save others in the tragedy of September 11, 2001, our Savior sacrificed himself to save the world from the worst terrorist of all time, Satan. Paul makes the point in Romans chapter 5, most people aren't going to be willing to put their own lives on the line for some random person, certainly for a wicked person. But then he notes that there are those brave few out there in the world who are going to be willing to go into harm's way to save someone else. Police, EMTs, firefighters, people who do this every day. But then he goes on to note that Jesus Christ was willing to do the same thing for everyone at the expense of his own life. Paul stated of Jesus, Colossians 1:14, in whom we have redemption. We didn't discuss redemption in our study of the Old Testament terms, but there's rich Old Testament heritage. And he mentions Leviticus 27, Psalm 31. Says Jack Cottrell in his book, God the Redeemer, defines redemption as, quote, the idea of rescuing or setting free by paying some kind of price. The word goel, the participle from the verb gael, was used to describe the word kinsman redeemer in the Old Testament, a near relative responsible for redeeming family members who had sold themselves into slavery or had sold their family land because of debt. Again, family members who were destitute, who were financially unable to care for themselves anymore. The kinsman redeemer also restored justice to those who were unable to provide it for themselves. Boaz played the role of kinsman redeemer for Ruth. God is our kinsman redeemer. The word redemption in Colossians 1:4 comes from a Greek word which means a releasing effected by payment of ransom. Does that sound familiar? Releasing by payment of ransom. We've been talking about it a lot over weeks. It tends to come up, I know in our previous discussions we've talked a lot about forgiveness versus what? Going to pay something. Starts with an A. Atonement. Atonement. Does this sound similar to what we've been discussing with atonement? The idea that you're going to pay a ransom. Okay, now tell me about atonement versus redemption. Now we talked a little bit about atonement versus propitiation, right? Because two very similar ideas. If I'm atoning for something, I've somehow wronged someone, I've aggrieved someone, and I'm going to pay or offer something to make it right. right? Like if somebody robbed you, right? I guess at least an initial step of atonement would be returning back what you stole from them. But it's like, what can I give you to make things right again? I've wronged you. What can I do? You say, well, okay, you robbed me and you beat me up. Give me back what you stole plus $1,000, and I'll consider that payment to make things right again. You will have atoned. Oftentimes, when someone is arrested and they're sentenced to jail, 5, 10, 20 years, whatever, when they get out, people say you've paid your debt to society, right? They've atoned. That's the idea, right? It's like you owed something for the wrong you committed, and you've paid for it, whatever that means, whether it's money or whether it's giving up your freedom for X number of years. Propitiation, similar idea. The idea behind propitiation is I'm doing something to assuage the wrath of the person that I've wronged. They're very closely related, right? Atonement is I'm going to pay something to settle the debt that I've incurred by aggrieving you. Propitiation is you're angry at me, you're wrathful, I'm going to do something to appease that, right? To make it so that you don't want to take my head off anymore. And the Bible speaks of both. Propitiation of God's wrath, the idea of atoning for sin, of something that can be paid to make it right. So, what about atonement versus redemption? They both involve paying something. What's the difference? Right, so if I'm redeeming, right, the person who was redeeming something has done nothing wrong. But they're similar to the idea they're paying something, they're giving something in order to settle things, to make things right again, right? But they haven't done anything wrong, right? Like Boaz and Ruth. He's like, okay, I'm going to take on the financial burden of making you my wife. I'm buying you back in that sense. Like I said, it could be, again, going back to the idea of redeeming a coupon, right? The store took a loss by offering this discount, so the manufacturer is going to pay them, they're going to buy it back to redeem the difference between what it would have cost and what they sold it for. Versus atonement, which is, again, similar, but the idea with atonement is I'm doing it because I've wronged you. In both cases, you're paying something, you're offering something in order to settle something. Atonement is the idea that I did something wrong and I need to pay to make it right. Redemption is I'm going to pay in order to buy something back and make it right, or to settle things. Does that make sense? Correct. He did both. He did both. Atoning in the sense that, how does the song go? It's a newer song. I owed a debt I could not pay. He paid a debt he did not owe. I may have that backwards, but so we as sinners incur a debt with sin, correct? It has to. Their atonement must be made. Like I said, somebody robs you, somebody beats you up. They need to atone for it, right? It's like you wronged me. You've got to do something to make this right. You've got to give me something. Jesus atones for our sin in that he paid the debt on our behalf. It's like you owed something, I paid it. The wages of sin is death. I paid the price for you. Redeeming, the idea that he's buying us back. He's paying the cost necessary to bring us back into a right relationship with God. So again, as we're talking about all these words, forgiveness, atonement, redemption, propitiation, they're all very, very closely related, but there are these shades of meaning between them. Remission of sins, or going back to the very top, page 84, we're released from the power of Satan and sin, but this release comes only with a ransom. The ransom paid for our freedom from sin was the blood of Jesus Christ. And he mentions 1 Peter 1:18. This redemption is affected by that. That's what's paid for the redemption. Remission of sins. Forgiveness in Colossians 1:14 is a Greek word, aphesis. You may recall from a discussion in chapter 6, this means pardon of sins, letting them go as if they had never been committed, remission or forgiveness of the penalty. Remission/forgiveness stress that we have been pardoned from the punishment we deserve, as we were just discussing. Redemption stresses that we are set free from what imprisoned us. We are not only like those trapped in the World Trade Center, we are also like the terrorists. And this is kind of driving at what we were just discussing. He both redeems and atones. It's like he plays the part of the innocent party and the guilty party at the same time, which is interesting. So we're like both. We're like the people that are trapped and like the ones who are responsible for trapping them. We are sinners who have attacked God. We are his enemies, Ephesians 2:15-16. So we deserve God's wrath. And propitiation is assuaging said wrath, to add another wrinkle to all this. However, he chose to punish his son instead of punishing us. Jesus paid the price for us, making peace between us and God. He atoned and redeemed simultaneously. Christ was treated as if he was us, so we could be treated as if we were him. Does this make sense to everyone? If you think too hard about it, you can tie your head and you can tie yourself into a pretzel. But you have multiple things going on. Kind of like we discussed. Is it forgiveness or is it atonement? Well, it's both. And it's kind of like when we talked about the goats there in Leviticus, the scapegoat and then the sacrifice goat. He's both, right? It's like, well, which goat is he? Is he the one that gets put on the altar or burned up? Or is he the one that has the sins loaded onto its head and sent off into the wilderness to die? One's atonement, one's forgiveness. Which is he? He's both. Which is he doing? Is he redeeming or is he atoning? He's doing both. It can be a bit hard to understand, but you kind of think about each one in turn and each fits. Imagine, page 84, bottom of the page, imagine it's 9:03 a.m. on April 19th, 1995. You've just dropped off your preschooler in the Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. A sudden explosion rocks the landscape. You turn to find smoke and rubble where you just left your child. Timothy McVeigh was executed July 11th, 2001 for setting off the bomb that resulted in the deaths of 168 people. That was his atonement. You've wronged these 168 people. What do you have to pay in order to settle the debt? Your life. Your life. I said sometimes atonement is a fine. Sometimes atonement is X number of years in prison. Sometimes atonement is your life. If your child had been one of the 19 killed by McVeigh's ruthless act, how would you feel about him? I don't know that I could even say. I think it's one of those things, I always say people look at Peter betraying Christ. It's like, I'd never do that, It's like, put yourself in his shoes. Maybe you would. I'd like to say that if I were in that position, I could have an attitude of forgiveness toward him. But quite frankly, unless I find myself in that boat, I don't know. How would you feel if your child had been one of those 19? Would you have been willing to take his place on death row? No. I think I can pretty safely say not a chance. Not a chance. And I think most honest people would say the same thing. Would you have been willing to adopt him into your family? Again, no. I dare say no. Certainly not. Does that sound ludicrous to you? And it does. We're in a Bible class, right? So it's you kind of give away the punchline a little bit. But if you were just randomly asked these questions in any other circumstance, right? Someone stopped you at Walmart and, it's like, hey, I'm taking because I know Brandy had to do this on occasion when she was in school. For one of my classes, I have to do this survey. I'm collecting data and I'm in a statistics class, whatever. And they ask you these questions. You remember this bombing? Yes. 19 children were killed. If it were one of yours, yes or no? And you go through these questions. And you're not thinking about it in terms of a Bible class because we're sitting here. It's like, of course I'd forgive them. Yes, I would adopt them because Jesus did. All right? It's like, No, if you were asked these questions just on the spot in any other context, you'd probably be like, of course not. Fry him, right? Look at what he did. Does it sound ludicrous? No, it doesn't, because I'm asking it in the context of a Bible lesson about redemption. If I were asking it in some other context, you'd be, of course, that's nuts. Why would you even suggest that? As he points out, this is exactly what God and Christ have done for all of us. This is what Paul, a former terrorist himself, literally, right? Paul went about terrorizing people, yanking families out of their homes, sending them to jail or worse, was saying of Christ, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. And I think this is something that Paul never forgot. You see it in multiple of his letters, even after he's an apostle, even after he suffered all these things for the cause of Christ, like he mentions in 2 Corinthians 11, he still refers to himself as the chief of sinners. He never lets it go. Anyway, we'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week. We'll continue on page 85.